Good afternoon, everyone, and it's really good to see so many friendly faces on the screen and so many people I know. I'd like to start by, I'll just make a reminder again, there's a few people I can hear in the background who aren't on mute, so please mute your microphones at this stage. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet. If you're here in Perth and where I am, we're meeting on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And WACOSS always recognises this land has never been ceded, and this land is the heart, soul and spirit for Aboriginal cultures across this nation. This is a first of a series of free weekly webinars about key topics facing the community service sector in WA. I don't want to say post the COVID pandemic health crisis because we're still in it. I know we've all leaped to talking about recovery, but definitely what we're seeing around the world and especially over in the eastern states. The pandemic and the health crisis is still with us, but we are starting and the recovery thinking and planning about how do we move forward over the economic impacts. In this series, we're inviting input and engagement from our members and the broader community service sector into our initial thinking and about what an inclusive plan for recovery needs to look like for the West Australian communities in order to leave no one left behind. We think this is a great opportunity to build back better, and we're really hoping that leadership will be shown here in this state. We don't want to go back to what it was like before COVID because we know there's so many people living in poverty, living in despair. And this is a real opportunity to reset our values of the West Australia community and about what's important. Each webinar features a presentation from WACOSS and some of our key partners, followed by opportunities for lots of questions and also for a discussion. We've been quite overwhelmed with the interest from the sector for these webinars. We've had lots and lots of registrations. I think there were 60 people registered for today, but knowing they're free, you know, sometimes people register and they don't always turn up. We hope you find these presentations and conversations really, really useful. And I'd like to hand over now back to Kylie, who will run you through today.
Great, thanks so much, Louise, and welcome everyone who's joining us. There's quite a few still coming through, so just a reminder to please ensure that your microphone is muted as you join the call. So today's topic, as Louise talked about, is an introduction to recovery thinking and planning. So WACOSS and a number of other community services sector peaks have been pretty involved in this as alongside the emergency management of COVID. And as we move into recovery, it's really important that we keep coming back to you all as members and members of the sector to ensure that the kinds of things that we're talking about, the thinking about and the input that we're providing into the different kind of mechanisms that we have is really reflective of your perspectives as well. In order to do that though, we needed to make sure we had a bit of a background introduction to this recovery thinking because we've been so involved with it that we want to make sure that you guys also understand the kind of precepts and concepts that underpin this idea of recovery. So we'll jump straight into it because we've got quite a lot to get through. I'd like to hand over to Chris Toomey, the policy leader here at WACOSS, and he's going to go through the starting kind of overview of recovery and what it means. So Chris.
Thanks a lot, Kylie. Welcome everyone. Look, just to start with, to give you a bit of context, when it comes to crisis management, there is international and national best practice approaches, and they really divide quite clearly in how you respond from a crisis through the emergency response stuff, which is very much about top-down command and control, and separate that quite clearly off to what happens recovery after that initial crisis, the stuff that's about how the community is recovering. And the issue there is that that's usually... There's a very strict difference between...
Now come in here and use your manners.
Look, someone needs to mute, please.
Instead of go and eat.
I can hear someone's kids
like
there.
Okay.
So there's a very strict decision between the emergency response, which is very much all about command and control. It's about guys in uniforms telling you what to do, and what happens during recovery, which is very much focused on being local, inclusive, and taking a community development approach to really helping the community be involved in making local decisions to rebuild their resilience. And one of the big challenges that we've got is this COVID crisis is not like anything we're used to. So there isn't a clear transition between the emergency phase and the community response and recovery phase. And a lot of the models sort of assume that. And so that's one of the reasons why there's a bit of confusion around, are we still in a crisis? Are we still in recovery? Because where we are at the moment actually has elements of both going on. We can go to the next slide now. Thanks, Ash. So you will have heard the phrase an unprecedented crisis being used by everyone. And it's very much something that's particularly true about this crisis. It also presents a huge challenge for community services in particular about how we enact our values during a crisis. And there's a real challenge that we've got between how we deliver the best outcomes for the whole of the community and how do we also make sure that we're leaving no one behind. So we've been relatively fortunate in Australia, and particularly in WA, that we haven't had the same crisis impacts happen from the health crisis. So we haven't seen the same level of deaths as we've seen in places like Italy, or we're now seeing in India and the US, where they had to make some very difficult decisions about who lives and dies, simply because of the lack of emergency beds and ventilators. However, we do face some similar challenges as community services about how we prioritise and balance our efforts. The problem is that in coming months, as we move through and into the recovery phase, we are expected to see increasing numbers of people who are struggling with financial hardship, who are finding themselves forced into poverty, and that's then having impacts on their mental health, on their relationships, and on their well-being. So there's a real challenge in that we're expecting that as the economic and social crisis and the impacts of that ramps up, that it's going to be overwhelming for us in terms of the level of demand that we're going to face. And the problem is particularly that a lot of the people we're going to be overwhelmed by are people who are coming to our services for the first time. They don't really understand how the service system works, and their expectations and the kind of support they want is probably going to be different. The other thing that's a challenge is that a lot of them are going to be located in areas that aren't the traditional disadvantaged areas. Many more of the people who are going to be the newly jobless, as we see the transition wind down as we approach September, are out in that aspirational mortgage belt. So there's a real challenge then in how we actually reach those people and how we provide support to them. And the challenge that we've got to do is that we've got to be able to balance what's the support we give to this newly disadvantaged group versus what's the support we continue to provide to those who are already disadvantaged and have been affected by this crisis in different ways. One of the challenges for us is that we know that prevention and early intervention is always the most effective approach. So if we can get in early to give the newly jobless good advice before they get too deep into a financial crisis, so that we cannot prevent them from bankruptcy, from losing their home or losing their small business, or from the stress of that financial crisis then impacting on their mental health or breaking down their relationships. We know if we can get in early, we can make a bigger difference, but we've got a real challenge in how do we get to these people? How do we reach them? But at the same time, then we're trying to balance that against the scale of the economic social impacts that we're expecting. And so we're really not thinking that we will have the capacity to meet the new level of demand given the level of services that we have at the moment. There is clearly going to be a need for state and federal governments to step in and provide more resources to community services as we see further increases to the number of jobless. The challenge we're going to face along the way is that they're going to be slow to do so, is what we fear. And so we're also potentially going to lack the capacity to ramp up and deliver that many services that quickly. So there's a real challenge for our existing service models as to whether we can actually deal with the type of need that's emerging and the scale of need that's emerging within current services. And then we've got to think about new locations. So these are some of the issues we're going to explore over this series, but there are some kind of real challenges for us going ahead where we're really going to need to come together as a sector and look at how we do things, how we can do things better, and then how we're engaging with the state government to demonstrate what has the greatest impact for people. You'll notice I've put there as well a point about the impact for frontline services. And frontline services are going to be critical in two different ways. One is they'll be the first point of contact for people who are newly experiencing hardship. So the better and more planned and involved they can be in giving people timely advice and support, what they can do quickly and simply through some brokerage funds to help people meet their immediate needs, but then also being able to tell them what to expect is coming, where to go to get assistance, and particularly also to break down some of that stigma around going and reaching out for help. So they're going to be critical in that way, but they're also going to be critical in providing us information about who is actually losing their job, what are their circumstances, what is the support that they actually need. Because one of the problems that we've got is we only know so much about who will actually lose their job. We can predict particular industries and particular roles will be harder hit, but a lot of the job losses are really going to depend on how sustainable were particular small businesses, particular services, particular organisations before the crisis hit, how well they've gone with their cash flow over the period, and what the ongoing impacts of the slowdown in the economy and ongoing shutdown in some areas is going to have for them. So to summarise, the first wave impact was clearly a health crisis. We've then moved into this economic crisis, but it's critical in doing so that we're making sure that we're not just focusing too narrowly on the economy, that we very much need to be seeing this as a social and economic crisis that we're dealing with, and that our key message should be that we're all in this together, we should leave no one behind. So yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So this stuff will probably be fairly familiar to you all. What we've seen is a similar but more dramatic pattern to what we saw in the global financial crisis, the GFC, and the 90s recession, in that it was a lot of people who were the last into employment who were the first out. So the biggest impacts have particularly been on young people and on women, and younger women as well. Also, we've seen some fairly dramatic and varied regional impacts. And also there will be different impacts for older workers. And we know from the 90s and the GFC that if you're over 55 or 60 and you lose your job for a couple of years, you may struggle to get back into employment and may be forced into early retirement. That's a different sort of challenge than what young workers are seeing, and particularly young people who are entering the workforce at the first time. We know from the GFC in the 90s that they could face a decade where they had this career scarring, where they haven't caught up to where they would otherwise be. They face a bigger struggle getting into work. If they're kept out of the workforce for a number of years, it makes it increasingly hard, and it'll impact on their lifetime earnings. So we know clearly what some of the biggest impact for sectors are, and there's a few links there that we'll provide later about some of the analysis, but retail, hospitality and tourism have clearly been the ones that have been both most hit, but also are facing the most ongoing impacts around the slowdown and shutdown, and particularly around international travel. And there's that challenge I talked about before about balancing, making sure that we're doing as much as we can quickly to help the newly jobless, but that we're not leaving anyone behind, and we're realising that this is making life more difficult for longer for those who are already disadvantaged before the crisis. And that's it for that slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So then on the next slide, what we have here is a fairly complex slide, and I've really just got a key point to make to it, because we'll make these slides available to you all later. But effectively, the idea of how we manage a public emergency or emergency management, that is a legislative framework, and this outlines what traditionally that legislative framework looks like. And usually if we have, you know, an emergency in a local area, say a bushfire, there's a very big emphasis on the role of local government. So effectively we see the development of an impact statement, which summarises the impact of what has happened during that emergency. And the local government is left with that impact statement with some support from federal and state government to effectively look at, you know, how we're going to deal with those impacts and to implement a recovery plan. What we've actually seen in this instance, because of the different nature of the emergency, is that recovery is shared and mostly led, I suppose, by the state government, but there's still a really important role to play for local governments. And I guess that was the key point that I was looking to make with this slide, is that I think a lot of our attention and reflection and influence is often on, you know, the state government's recovery plan, and of course it is being led there, but it's important to also acknowledge the important role that local governments will play in terms of recovery. So next slide. So these are a series of national disaster recovery principles which inform and underpin the recovery phase that we're seeing now. And I won't go through them in a lot of detail. We can make these available to you afterwards and a link to where they can be found. But it's just worth noting at both the state and local level, these are the principles that will, I guess, inform the recovery and what's important as a part of that recovery process. Next slide. And so within the state, and so now we're going to shift into what recovery looks like within the state for those of you that might not have had so much, I guess, engagement or exposure to what that plan looks like. So within the state, we've got a plan which is effectively consists of 5 sub-plans. So we've got a health sub-plan, which is being led by the WA Department of Health, a social sub-plan, which is being led by the Department of Communities, one focus on economic and infrastructure, which is being led by Treasury, an industry-focused sub-plan led by JETSI, so Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation, and then a region sub-plan, which is being led by the Department of Finance. And so I think the next slide will go into the detail of the consultation. So some of you might have been involved in the consultation of this plan at different points, but effectively what we've seen is the establishment of a state recovery controller, which is a little bit different to what's ordinarily seen in that, if you think about that slide we showed before, a little bit different to the normal legislative framework for recovering from an emergency. There's been an advisory group established, and there's also a steering group established for recovery. And then, as I mentioned, each of the departments is responsible for each of those sub-plans, acknowledging, of course, that there are interconnections across each of those plans, right? You know, life doesn't happen in individual silos. And so then we can also see that a number of already existing bodies are being leveraged, and there's a lot of engagement with them in terms of getting input into the recovery plan. And some of you might have had some exposure to iThink, which is a public sector commission platform. So there was a number of, I guess, the 5 recovery areas were put onto iThink, and people were able to submit, any person, public or sector, was able to submit ideas for what they think would be useful in recovery through iThink. So that's what the consultation strategy has been from the state government in terms of the recovery plan. Next one. And in terms of the time frame, so in June, we saw the impact statement released. So that's, as I mentioned before, the statement that's legislatively required, which goes through, well, what has the impact been on the state as a result of COVID. Throughout June and July, there was a series of roundtables and engagement. That information has been pulled together through July by DPC. Ideas are being fed through to responsible departments, and the impact statements and recovery plans are being finalised. So we expect to see the finalised impact statements and recovery plans probably towards the end of July or in August. And that timeline at the bottom of this slide, and sorry, there's a bit of a odd viewing, and we'll make sure that's fixed up for when we send it out to you. You can see the longer range timeline from state government at the bottom there. So originally we had this sort of controlled reopening and relaxation moving through to June. The careful restarting and stimulation, which is projected to go through to December, but then also acknowledging that recovery is going to take some time. So it's not something that's kind of going to be over and done within about 6 months. It's something that is going to continue through probably for at least another 18 months. And so that just gives you a little bit of a sense on what that time frame has looked like and what's happened in terms of the recovery planning from state government's perspective. Can you just go to the next slide, Ashley? Yeah, so Chris has just got a couple of points to make in terms of comment on that plan, and then we'll take some questions. So Chris, I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, these are just a few of the concerns and worries that we've had about how the recovery response has been handled at the state level. One of the concerns that we've had certainly early on was that there was a bit of a scattergun approach in terms, particularly around the consultation and around who was planning to do what. So there was very much a sense that it was grasping for bits here and there, and that there wasn't a clear kind of prioritisation process around making decisions. And from our point of view, in terms of the work that we were doing, we were all working very hard within the sector and finding information and wanting to connect up and provide support and advice. And we're struggling to find out, okay, where do we take it within what consultation mechanisms and what planning processes within the state government so that we can clearly feed it in. And so one of the concerns had been that WA was very slow to roll any money out to frontline services. So in a lot of the other states, we saw an immediate 20, 25, 30% increase to some of those key frontline services like emergency relief, financial counselling, whereas here there was a lot more of a delay and a lot more of requests for information and analysis around what was needed where. The second concern that we had was very much that the big consultation processes around some of those ministerial roundtables were actually happening at a time when the ERC, the economic decision-making body within Cabinet, had actually already had most of their meetings. And so we're a bit concerned that we were being consulted at a point where we didn't get an opportunity to feed into that first part of the process that was going to fund that immediate 6-month response. The other concern that we've had is that a lot of the issues and concerns that we've been advocating on have very much to do with the wider economic impacts. And very much the community services, we've often felt we're pigeonholed into the social response. The focus was just on vulnerable groups, whereas actually what we were trying to do is provide information around who were the potentially at-risk people that we wanted to prevent from becoming vulnerable in the first place. So one of the things that's been challenging there, they'd broken down their response and recovery planning into 5 different areas. There was economic and infrastructure, social, industry, health, and regions. And you can see a lot of the things that we do cut across all of those. And so it was tricky then to work out how do you put forward cross-cutting proposals that are going to impact on all of these, but may not be a particular priority on any one of those areas. And the other concern that we've had is that the state government were very effective in their first response to the crisis in taking that top-down and controlled approach. And our concern has been they've then stuck to that model. They felt like that's been working for them. They haven't shifted to that place-based, community-based approach to recovery and haven't been putting resources into that kind of local planning, which is actually the stuff that we know when it comes to recovery, when it comes to resilience, when it comes to having an effective response to what's actually happening on the ground in different communities. We know that's the stuff that works. So, and the final concern that we've had there is that a lot of the stuff we've been advocating has been around the care economy. So the stimulus impacts that investing into caring services actually has. And there's some very good and very strong analysis from around the world. There's some very good recent stuff from the UK Women's Budget Group, for example, that actually shows if you're spending money on stimulus measures, if you're spending money specifically to have an impact on your local economy, you're far better off spending that money on people rather than on stuff. You're better putting money into building services, particularly services that are helping people who are already vulnerable, services that are making people more productive, rather than putting money into something where most of your money ends up going into bricks and mortar or into bitumen. So our concern has been they've seen care economy as an ongoing cost and not actually seeing that if you put money out to the largely women who are working in community services, that money gets spent straight away in local communities on essential goods and services and has that big, triple impact when it comes to the economy. That's done for that slide.
And if, Chris, we can keep it to a minute each for these slides, that'd be awesome.
Okay, so very quickly, these are just some of these 5 key ideas, and there's that document that we've shared with you, and we'll make all of these available. One of them had been working with WA. We picked up this based on a working for Victoria model. So it was very much, how do you link job search, job creation, recruitment and training together? So how do you have some community connectors in place who can very much connect people up, can identify what skills they've got, can connect them to local employment opportunities. And our real concern here is that the existing job search system actually has perverse incentives that kick people into training that's not going to help them, rather than providing an employer with the dozen best people in the local economy looking for work who would best fit their needs. Okay, next one. So these were a few things we'd highlighted about some concerns in the gaps in the WA response around family and children's services. And there's some detailed work that the Children's Policy Advisory Committee did on this. So you'll all be familiar with the childcare funding crisis. And we had a pile of problems in the first response. And then we've had the problem where the money for childcare funding was the first thing that was pulled out. Just at the time that they were talking about putting stimulus into construction, they were pulling that money out of childcare funding, and that has a double impact. It impacts on the largely women working in early childhood education and care, and then it impacts on working women who were relying on that childcare there for them to be able to work. And we saw in the first phase of the crisis that if childcare centres were closed down, around a quarter of our frontline emergency health and social service workers would be taken out. So that stuff's been really critical. These are some of the areas that we've also raised and passed on information to the state government: family violence, child abuse, young people from disadvantaged areas missing from school, at-risk families missing from a lot of the services and appointments and so on. So these are all things that we've raised because they are the type of problems where we want to intervene early, and if we leave them, we know they'll cost us more in the longer term. So next slide.
I think that's that. Thanks, Chris.
Yep,
so
great.
I just wanted to open it up here to see if anyone had any questions of clarification or anything they don't understand. So you can either kind of type, or I'm having a look to see if anyone's got a hand raised, or if I'm missing you completely, you could just start speaking. No questions? Yeah, Alison.
Oh, hi, sorry. Yes, I'm just wondering, you mentioned local government earlier, so I'm with the City of Wanneroo, and I'm just wondering if you want to talk a little bit more about how you see the role of local government. I'm one of the community development planning team at Wanneroo, so we have community development planners and community development officers, and we work together as one team. And I know that at that sort of coordinator manager level, they are putting together things that are going into the sort of impact statements that the state are pulling together, and that they're coordinating those through all local governments. And so at the officer level, we've all been asked to contribute to that. Again, we've kind of replicated what the state's done with sort of vulnerable cohorts a little bit, which I totally agree. The comments earlier around, you know, that makes it difficult around cross-cutting issues and responses. But yeah, just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about how you see the role of local government, what we can be doing, how we could work with the rest of the sector.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. That's a really good point. Look, for me, there are three key critical things about local government. One is there's some structural stuff that already exists there. So when it actually comes to you know, the rules and the structures around disaster and recovery response and planning, local government has a key role. And where local government has, you know, as you guys do, that community development capacity, they can play an absolutely critical role in that. The second thing is very much what we were talking about earlier about that local engagement and that place-based planning. So how do you actually have a recovery response that's dealing directly with that local information and evidence around what's needed, what are the strengths, what are the challenges for the local community. The third one that's been a very interesting, important role for local government in the response has been, for a lot of the newly jobless people, we've actually found, because of the ongoing kind of community stigma around coming forward and looking for help, a lot of people have been going to local government rather than local charities to actually get emergency relief, to get food packages or assistance with things. And so local government can then also be a key meeting place and a key place for information and referral around where are the local services, where can we get help locally. And having said that, I think there's a fourth thing that I can actually add in there as well, which is saying local government often has or is connected to a lot of those kind of local resources and meeting places that could be critical in some of these new areas where we haven't got established services to put together something where people can come and get support and assistance. So partnerships between local government and some of the capacity with the community services sector there, where we've got different skills and different abilities, could be really fundamental in putting together responses quickly and effectively in those areas where we don't have the existing services or we need a different approach to reach out. So I know that there's a pile of frontline community services who are now looking to see what things can they trial in some of these areas, and are looking at ideas like either partnering with local government to put a service in, or looking at where's there a shop front in, you know, an empty bankrupt store in the local supermarket, or, you know, in the local shopping centre, where we can set up a service to reach people. And then how do we build on that local capacity and resilience? How do we involve people in developing and delivering their own solutions? Because we know internationally from disasters, it's those local responses that are the most powerful and are the most effective in the long term in building local resilience and getting people reconnected. So yeah, thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Al.
Can I just comment on that
Sure.
a little bit from Wanneroo perspective? We've done, I think, all of the above that you've mentioned there. We certainly entered into a couple of collaboration agreements, like we've got, I think, along with quite a few of the other shires as well, have got a agreement with Vinnie's for local food relief service and so on. But one of the things that we've also done is, like a lot of organisations, I guess we sometimes tend to work a bit in silos. So we do have our economic advocacy and economic development team. So we've set up a collaboration group, an internal collaboration group with them, and we're looking at employment. And we've definitely also got the place-based approach. So we have areas like the hub in Girraween, which we use as a, and also Y-Track up in Yanchep. We've got like job provided, like people like APM and people like that we've got in there. And we're working up through that collaboration group some other ideas around what we can do around employment particularly. But it is very difficult when, you know, there's a lot of things we probably can do, but then if the jobs aren't going to be there, and also the other major thing, which we've just got our budget approved, thankfully, and that means that we've got some funds for business support and also community organisations that will now be able to be activated.
Okay. Thanks, Alison.
That's excellent. Can I add one more quick comment, Kyla? Because I think that last point's really important. So we're going to get to a phase post-September where state government's going to need to be thinking about what resources are they putting into job creation. And that's where there's an excellent opportunity to actually be doing stuff that's locally effective, is partnering with local government around some of those job creation schemes. So that's great. It's good to hear Vinnie's are doing that work. We've heard similar stuff with Anglicare in Armidale, St Pat's and Fremantle and so on, where those collaborations are really working.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Alison. I'm just going to move us on. If you do have additional questions as we go, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up either during the webinar or afterwards. But I do want to move us on because we want to make sure we hear from more of you. And so we have some time, sort of 10 to 15 minutes of breakout room conversation. But before we do that, I'm just going to get Chris to talk a little bit about the 5 key ideas for recovery that WACOSS has put up so far, because we'd really love to get your perspective on those. So Chris.
Okay, great. Look, these are 2 key documents that we've produced that we'll make available for you. I'll just give you some context very quickly. So coming back to that slide of Kylie's, you saw there was that orange bit, which was the first 6 months, which was the first phase of the immediate response that the state government was focused on. And then there was that grey bit, which was the longer term. We were looking out 2 to 5 years. And so we've said this is stage one, 5 key ideas to put us on the path to recovery. These things we've geared around specifically as our intervention to what we were advocating for the state government to do in those first 6 months. So if we can jump over to the next slide. Okay, here are the first 3. So what you will see about these is they are focused very much on short to medium term things that are very much focused on the state government's priorities around jobless and the bounce back in the economy. So there was that discussion about connecting the new jobless, that the fact that we need an involved kind of engaged outreach campaign to all WA households that's talking about what to expect, helping them to manage the recovery process, and it's very much encouraging them about how to engage with local community connectors to provide advice, quickly connect them where they need help, to have at hand some small grants that they can use to kind of broker some immediate assistance, emergency relief. This second one, working with WA, this is very much based on the model we've already seen rolled out called Working for Victoria, which is very much a job creation program, but it's very much also about, okay, how we're getting the connection between a focus on where we want to be creating jobs together with some analysis and advice that's being given to people around what are the skills that you've got, what are the opportunities that you might have in the future. Should you be immediately looking for jobs in these areas, or should you be looking at doing some additional training? So part of that is also like connecting up with a lot of those local TAFE skills centres and how we can use that to really leverage some investment around creating some jobs for the future. And a particular focus of that is the opportunity for creating jobs in the care economy. So a focus on a couple of things. One is areas where we know there's already unmet need, or we know that there's growing need into the future. So aged care and disability services in particular, also early childhood education is another area. And then there are those areas that are directly about the response to the crisis. So that's financial counselling, emergency relief, mental health, alcohol and drug services, family and relationship services, those kind of areas. As I said before, we know it's very effective stimulus. We can focus on putting some resources in there, knowing that those resources will have a great impact on the economy, but will also be adding social value. And so that's why, like I saw Taryn saying their mental health, those things are really critical now, and it's a great opportunity. The fourth one there is saying, why don't we use this opportunity now to really focus on delivering some generational outcomes for Aboriginal human services employment? So making a long-term commitment now, setting some goals that are for the next 5 to 10 years, where we're actually saying about how we're going to create local jobs, how we're going to build local economies, how we're going to build back better by investing in particular, making sure that it's Aboriginal community controlled services that are delivering those local and regional services. The fifth thing there was talking about the focus we need to be having in regional jobs, but particularly around this approach that we've seen has been successful in other places in the world as a kind of, a community development strategy around how do you take a community wealth building approach to identify what are your local and regional specialities, opportunities, skills, what are some local sustainable jobs that you can be creating. One of the things that comes up there in particular is often there are key anchor institutions that you might be creating in a regional centre that a whole pile of industries and jobs come around. And, sometimes those anchor institutions could be things like universities. Other times they are a particular kind of industry and speciality that you might have in an area due to the combination of your natural benefits, your position in the kind of wider global region, and the resources you have. And the focus there is very much around what do we do that's building diverse and resilient economies in regional areas. And the final thing, like we said, it's 5 key ideas, but we just wanted to highlight across all of these that the vision was about resilient and inclusive communities, and that what was core to all of these was a focus that was about social inclusion and well-being. And the final thing I wanted to comment here is the information and feedback we've been getting about the dramatic change we've been seeing in community attitudes from people in response to the crisis, in response to thinking that they themselves could lose their jobs and their incomes, that their friends, their family, they've actually seen doing so, that people's attitudes have changed and they want us to be building back better. They want us to be more inclusive about this. They want to see more investment that's going into care services, into sustainable industries, and making sure that no one's left behind. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Kyle.
Great, thanks, Chris. So we're going to go straight into some breakout room conversation now. So what Chris has outlined there is actually a bit of a taster for the rest of the webinar series. We will go through each of those in a little bit more detail, and we hope that you will be able to join us for some of those conversations as well. But for right now, I guess we're just really interested to get you talking to one another and understanding what you or your service are really thinking about in terms of recovery, what hopes you have and your concerns that you might be experiencing, and what trends you're seeing in your work that you're most challenged by. And so feel free to also introduce yourself to one another. I'm pasting into the chat right now the Google Doc that was sent out to you beforehand, and we'd really appreciate any input or notes that you might feel like popping into that. That would just really help us in terms of being able to refine our asks and our information, and I guess the message that the sector would like WACOSS to be representing moving forward. And I will just bring attention to Irma's comment in the chat about thinking about not just reverting back to the new normal, which Chris also just alluded to. I think it is important for right now for us to be taking advantage of this opportunity to think, you know, normal didn't work for everyone, and particularly the kinds of people that we're supporting. And so how can we create a more inclusive, equitable system for all? So I'm just going to pop you into breakout rooms now. We'll, effectively, if you haven't used this before, Zoom will automatically pop you into rooms of about 5 or 6 participants. So you'll be able to have a much smaller group conversation, hopefully around these topics. Hi everyone, I think we should all be back now. It looks like not many of you accepted the advance invite to rejoin, which I hope means you are having some good conversations in the breakout rooms. So I hope if you hadn't used that function before that you enjoyed it. And I guess from our perspective, we are really interested in using this webinar series to make sure we hear from you. And so that, you know, being able to have small group discussions and really hear from you is important to us. But I will just see, Chris, did you have any closing comments that you might want to make?
No, not really. I thought we had a really interesting and productive discussion that was across both the community sector and government, and talking about the opportunities for collaboration, and also really about how we were coming back to our shared values and focusing on what is it that we can do together that has the biggest impact for the community as a whole, but also that is leaving no one behind.
Yeah, great. And we can hopefully continue to explore some of these issues through our upcoming webinars. So I might draw to a close and just thank you so much for attending this first one and for being involved. We will make available the materials that Chris referenced, as well as the PowerPoint slides. We will also be sending a very brief survey monkey out just to get some opinions from you on how this format went. And so we very gratefully appreciate it if you wouldn't mind. It's going to be only 5 questions, so not much at all really. And we definitely would love to see you in more of the webinars. So, you know, and invite your colleagues. We, you know, really want to make sure we get as much voice from the sector as we possibly can. So thanks so much everyone for being involved today, and hopefully we'll see you in future sessions.